The main way to improve at chess is to study a lot, of course, but the other way is to play a lot. And a consequence of this is that you actually lose some games of chess. If you look at any top player, they will have lost games of chess. And it's part of the learning process, you could say, about any chess player. How do you come back from defeats? How do you learn from your mistakes? What happened in the game that caused you to lose? And you build up bits of knowledge in this way. So the game I'm going to look at now is a game of Karjakin in the World Under-10 Championships, played in the year 2000. And here he plays against a very strong player, even at the time, and he's now a strong player, over 2700 rated, Maxime Vachier Lagrave of France. And it's clear these two will be rivals for a long time. I'll be talking about that a lot later in this DVD. But here we see Karjakin actually lose. And the reason I'm going to show this is because although Black played a lovely tactic in order to get Karjakin, it just goes to show how even the top players do lose games. And I'm sure Sergei will have understood from his coach or by himself when studying, what went wrong. How do I avoid this for the future, and what can I learn from this? This is the main thing as a chess teacher, is to explain to any pupil of mine. Can you learn from mistakes and make sure that they don't happen again? Now, the game started with a Sicilian, which we talked about in Chapter 1, and after the open Sicilian, Black played Vachier Lagrave played g6, so this is the accelerated dragon. Now, because White's knight isn't on c3, hasn't been forced to play c3, he can now play a certain pawn structure called the Maroczy bind with c4. And the point about that move is that White is trying to prevent Black from playing a d5 pawn break, or later on in the game to play the b5 pawn break. So White's basically trying to gain space in this variation. Now, nowadays, we would probably say to young players, you don't really want to play the Maroczy bind because it involves a lot of manoeuvring, and that's something that young players don't tend to do very well. Even a strong player like Karjakin would probably have been advised to try and play the knight c3 variation, and just play something like this, the more open kind of variations, which probably suit his style a lot more. So after c4, of course, this is a very popular variation, and we're going to see how both sides develop. And now Black played a variation which, of course, Vachier Lagrave will have had to study, knight g4. Of course, he realises that the queen can just capture this knight, but the point is that then Black has this knight under attack. So after queen takes g4, Black played knight takes d4. And not only is Black threatening this knight c2 check, Black's also trying to unleash the bishop on c8 by playing d5. So, for example, if White played rook c1, we talked about how the Maroczy bind pawn structure tries to prevent Black from playing any pawn break. But here, Black can actually get it in straight away because the queen is being attacked. So we see Karjakin just retreat with the queen. Now, he's not going backwards because what he's doing is he's attacking the Black knight on d4. And it still means that Black has to do something about that. There are many different variations, but he played knight e6. Probably not the most obvious square if you don't know this variation. But actually the knight on e6 is very strong because it still looks at all these very nice squares. Especially the c5 one, which could be quite useful. Rook c1, d6, and both sides simply develop their pieces in castle, like this. Notice, by the way, Black hasn't castled, but he will do. I should probably explain why Black went a5. The point about that was that when Black played knight c5, as we just saw here, he doesn't want to allow White to play b4 and gain space. Now, this b4 pawn break by White is one of White's strategies in this position in the Maroczy bind, which is, if we can get b4 in, White will now gain space on the queen side. And that's what he is going to be trying to do. So a5 is a very clever move by Black, and if you sort of intending to play the Maroczy bind or the accelerated dragon as Black, it's a key variation to know, this key strategy for Black to prevent White from gaining space on the queen side like that. So a5 preventing White from playing b4 here. Now you might think, well, can't White just play a3 and renew that threat? Well, what we're going to see is that if White were now to play a3, Black can play queen b6. He's self-pinning along this diagonal, but what he's trying to do is attack the pawn on b3, and it's very difficult for White to defend against that, because he can't play b4, black has too many pieces on it, and he can't play rook b1 to defend it, because his knight on c3 will hang. I hope you noticed that, by the way. So what does he do? I think white's actually losing something in this position. Or white's got to play bishop takes c5, and he doesn't want to do that, because what will happen now is it's check and he'll lose the pawn anyway, like this. But just generally, white does not want to give up his bishop pair, and I'll be talking about that in just a moment. So after knight c5, white decided to sensibly develop, queen d2, and now black castled and rook f d1. So we talked about white's strategy. Well, white would like to play a3 and b4. The problem for white, though, is that his rooks are actually on bad squares, and this is one of the reasons why we talked about sort of recommending certain variations for young players. This involves a little bit of manoeuvring, and it's sort of clear that Kajakin either has been tricked into this, or he maybe didn't even know what the strategy was. Probably he got to this position and realised, well, I want to play b4, but how am I going to play that? Because the b pawn will just be attacked if I move the a pawn. So maybe I've got to play rook b1, but then that might leave my knight on c3 weak. So a lot of things for him to worry about. And you might think, well, on the other side of the coin, what's black trying to do? Well, black can't really play b5 or d5, but what black can do is go f5 at a certain moment. But also black has another sort of formation which we're going to see in the game. He played queen b6 again, and the idea is to move the f rook to c8. So it's kind of a jostling for position. Who's trying to play on the queen side? We were thinking that white was trying to play on the queen side with b4, but maybe it's black trying to play on the queen side with rook f c8 on this square, and attempting to do something maybe down here. So knight d5, and black kind of has to take it, and c takes, rook f c8. So who do we think's better? We normally say that the bishop pair is very useful in an open position, and in this position I think it is an open position. Although, on the other hand, black has a very nice bishop on g7 to counter, and the knight is very well stabilised here. Again, we said that the pawn on a5 prevents white from playing b4. That's a very important point, because if that wasn't there, b4 would win immediately due to this pin on the queen. So, what does white do? Well, Kajakin decided, I'm going to play rook c2 and double up on the c file. Now, I actually think black's got an okay position here anyway, but Vachier Lagrave uncorked an excellent idea here. It's very strategic, very tactical, but it's based on strategical grounds, which is, if black could try to exchange these bishops off, white will be left with a bishop on e2 against a knight on c5, and probably I would prefer the knight on c5, because the bishop on e2, the white squares are not so efficient for white in this position. Whereas that knight on c5 stands on an excellent square, doesn't it? So how does black try and swap off those bishops? He played bishop h6, a stunning concept from the young French player, and it clearly shows that he understands how to play the accelerated dragon for black. He understands which pieces he should try and swap off or not swap off, and he does it with a stunning move like this. Now, if white were to just ignore that, if he was to play rook c1, we see black's idea like this, and queen b4. And the point is that black is doing all the action on the queen side, and the knight is so well defended on c5 here, that white's rooks are pretty ineffective. They look very nice, but they're not really doing anything. So I think that black would I can't claim black's better, but I think black is just completely fine here. So Kajakin decided to bite the bullet, and he took the bishop, which is the obvious move. But now that leaves some nice tactics along here. Of course, Kajakin checked that after knight takes b3, it attacks the queen, and of course it's check, isn't it? He could have gone knight takes e4 for the same idea, but I think queen e3 will transpose. It's not as good, because what we're going to see is black actually gain these two pawns and have a passed a pawn. It'll all become clear in just a few moves. So after knight takes b3, white had to do something. He went bishop e3. So black is a piece down. He already sacrificed his bishop. Let's hope that Vachier Lagrave has checked his tactics, and he of course has. Rook takes c2. Now there's a lot of pieces going on, so if for some training, you would like to stop the video or pause the video to see, what you think's going on. It would help you develop as a tactical player. And the position is very complicated, so very impressive play from both players to really go into this minefield here. And we see that white is actually under a bit of trouble here, because if queen takes c2, black can take on e3, and it's even worse because after this, knight d4, black is a pawn up and he has the fork on the two pieces. So after rook takes c2, he went queen d3, probably, and this is my guess, that Karjakin got to this position and thought, I'm probably just winning here, because I'm attacking the queen, the rook's attacked, and the knight is attacked. How does black save everything? But possibly Vachier Lagrave had seen one move further, and he played a really nice move, knight c1. I mean, this is you could not imagine this position from just 5 moves ago. This sort of tactical mess has occurred, and what is going on? Well, again, the queen cannot capture the bishop because the bishop on e3 is hanging. If he plays rook takes c1, black can take on c1, and the bishop is pinned, isn't it? It cannot take the rook. So black would be 2 exchanges ahead. So after knight c1, he took the queen, and a queen swap occurred. Now normally, 2 bishops outweigh a rook. But what we see here is that white is a little bit planless. The bishops haven't really got any good squares, whereas black's plan is quite simple. Let's get these queenside pawns rolling down the board and just push them. And the rook on a is very well placed. It hasn't moved yet, but it's very well placed to help that a pawn push the rook down there. So we said rooks behind passed pawns, and if you can put your rook behind your own passed pawn, it's going to be very effective, as we see. And this induced a mistake, actually, from Karjakin. In fact, he moved the rook away, but I still think a4 was a good idea as well, just pushing the pawn. Maybe he was a little bit concerned about bishop c4. I mean, black has to be a little bit careful that he's not going to lose his rook in this manner, which would be a bit of a disaster for Vachier Lagrave here. So instead he went rook c8 and rook b1. Actually, this was a mistake which went unpunished, but black could have played rook d2 with this skewer. But do we generally see that black has the easier position here? His pawns are worrying white enough to play moves like rook b1, and in fact he's left his bishops on pre. So after rook b3, a4. In fact, he can play rook c1 check and win the bishop. So many tactics for black in this position and not for white. So in the game he played rook b1, rook a4, but even in this position he actually resigned because black is going to be able to push the a pawn like this, and I think white has been caught in this pin. So if we just show a quick variation to back this up, king f2, a4, and in fact he can just simply sacrifice the pawn, and white actually loses a bishop. So what can we learn from that? Well, I talked about openings and how you should play openings that suit your style of play, and I don't think Karjakin played the Maroczy bind. I think it doesn't really suit him, so that's why he actually changed his variation from the Maroczy to the knight c3 variation, and I saw many games of him at the age of 11 or 12 where he played that. So he learnt from his mistakes. Although this was a big tournament for him in the World Under 10 Championships, again, he looked at what happened and he learnt from it. And that's a very important thing for a chess player to do.